So like Aaron said, we're going to be looking at teaching with comprehensible input, specifically pertaining to our Storyscape. So I'm Melisa Ferguson, like Aaron introduced. I'm now working with Osage Digital, but I did spend a lot of years in the classroom since 2006. I've taught Spanish and French, mostly Spanish. Started out as a traditional teacher, and then I discovered the comprehensible input and really loved that method of teaching. So I started using that and have used it for several years, and now I'm here at Osage. So let's see. All right, so today what we're going to look at is, first of all, we're going to talk about what is teaching with comprehensible input, which is called CI by people that use it. Then we're going to talk about how CI is different from traditional language teaching, the way that I started out teaching, and how is CI different, the comprehensible input, how is that different? We'll talk about ways to make input comprehensible. So how do you take what you're teaching and make it so that your students can understand it? Then we'll look at some strategies that you can use to implement CI in the classroom and how that's included with our Storyscape. And then we'll take a look at some advantages of teaching with comprehensible input, what makes this new way of teaching valuable. So starting out, what is teaching with comprehensible input, or CI? So comprehensible input, it was based on Stephen Krashen's comprehensible input hypothesis. And what he said was that comprehensible input is I plus one. Okay, so what's I plus one? What it really boils down to is that when you're using comprehensible input, everything that you say or read or do in class is based on what students already understand, plus just a little bit more to push their language boundaries a little bit further. So that plus one is that little bit of extra information to, expand their language abilities. So you're really just basing it on what do the kids already know? What vocabulary do we know? What cognates can we use? And then pushing a little bit further with that plus one to make it comprehensible input. And it is different from traditional language teaching in several ways. We're going to focus on two of those toward today, and just how that's different from like how you've learned different languages, how we all learn different languages. How is this different than the traditional way of doing it? So the first way that is different is in vocabulary. So with traditional teaching, it's usually, really long vocabulary lists, lots and lots of words that students have to actually, memorize. So it's memorized lists of vocabulary words. With comprehensible input, we're not focusing on vocabulary lists. Instead, we're looking at target structures. And target structures are usable chunks of language that students can use for communication. And they're not memorized. Instead, it's something that they've heard so many times that they acquire it. They can use it without even having to think about it because it just makes sense to them. So I included a screenshot of some vocabulary from our Storyscape to show you how that's different. So it's a lot shorter than what you're going to see in a traditional text. There's not a huge long list of words, and there's usable chunks of language. Like normally you're not going to see 3 words together. They don't meet. But in comprehensible input, you put those together so that students can use it for communication. So it's more about using little pieces of language that they can communicate with rather than memorize individual phrases that they have to piece and chunk together to try to make sentences. So we're looking at target structures in comprehensible input as opposed to vocabulary lists of isolated words. Another way that comprehensible input is different is in the communication goals that we set for our students. So with traditional teaching, you're really focusing on accurate communication. All the verbs are conjugated correctly. Spelling is perfect, punctuation, accent marks are where they need to be. And that's what you're looking at when students are communicating, is how perfectly did they say what they need to say? Is everything accurate? With comprehensible input, the focus is more on effective communication. So it's more of, can the students get their point across? Can they make themselves understood, as opposed to, are they perfect? So with effective communication, it's more about, do we know what they're saying, even if there are some mistakes? So I took an excerpt from one of our rubrics in our Storyscape just to kind of show you what that looks like. So looking at column number 3, highlighted in blue, the things that we're looking at here that's kind of different than traditional teaching is they're using words or short phrases to communicate. They can even use nonverbal gestures. So again, we're not emphasizing perfection here. We're emphasizing communication. And another thing that really jumped out at me in this rubric is that they're creative in using this vocabulary. So with CI, comprehensible input, we're really trying to encourage students to take ownership of the language and use it to communicate things that they want to say. So not memorize phrases, but what do you want to say and how can you rearrange this vocabulary, our target structures, to talk about yourself and be creative? Looking at column 4, so like the highest scores in yellow here, we're focusing on an exchange of ideas, like a successful exchange of ideas. So not are you perfect, but can you get your ideas across? Can you share these ideas with other people using the target language, even if it's not perfect? And then looking at that, we're not looking at perfection. Down here in the yellow, it says, my errors don't impede people understanding me. I can communicate effectively. So yes, they are going to make errors in comprehensible input, and that's okay. So that's kind of a mind shift that you have to make. Like, yes, errors are okay. What we're looking for here is communication. Can the students communicate their ideas by taking the language and making it their own? So that it really does seem like a huge mind shift, like, oh, I don't know if I can do this comprehensible input stuff. So to allay some of your fears, we do give you the best of both worlds in our Storyscape. So you do get the comprehensible input, but you also get the traditional teaching. So you don't have to be all in with comprehensible input right now. You can, ease yourself into it, and then you've got that traditional teaching that you can fall back on. So what I have here are some excerpts that are taken right from the menu of the text. So you can see, like, we have our comprehensible input source here. So you've got some stories that go along with it, 5 stories. That's the CI part. That's the comprehensible input where you're going to be using these strategies. But you also have your grammar, which is, just falling back on what you know. So you know how to teach grammar, you can do that. You also have some vocabulary sections. This is, again, a safety net, so you don't have to be all in with comprehensible input. You've got the grammar, you've got the vocabulary. These are more traditional things that you can do. And our Storyscape kind of wraps it all together. So your students are getting a really, really immersive and complete experience with the language. They're getting the CI part of it. They're also getting the traditional stuff so they can communicate and they can be accurate at the same time. So now that we know what comprehensible input is, how do we take what we're teaching and make it comprehensible? There's lots of ways to do this, and it's not as hard as it might seem. So the first one is translation, super simple. And in our Storyscape, we give translations of the vocabulary, and that makes it comprehensible. So very simple. So you can see that we give the vocabulary word, and then we give the translation right there. That makes that input comprehensible for students to understand. Illustrations are also key for comprehensible input. So a lot of the stories in our Storyscape have these great illustrations that go along with them. And these illustrations just make the story come to life. So as the students are reading, they can look at the words on the page, and then they can look at the illustration, and it makes it a lot more clear to them. What is the story trying to express? They can picture it, they can understand it much better. So illustrations are key for comprehensible input. You can also have the students illustrate themselves if you want to. So looking at a story, have them illustrate, share with other people. Illustrations are just so important for comprehensible input. Another way that you can make input comprehensible is through acting. So our Storyscape has tons of stories in it. You can take students, volunteers, to become the characters in the story, and you can read the story and have the students pose and act and sometimes read parts of the dialogue to make it comprehensible. When the students in the class see their classmates acting out that story, it helps it to come alive and be that much more understandable. And then there's props. Students love getting props in their hands. So anything like stuffed animals from your kids or nieces and nephews, little things that you pick up here and there, anything that can be used to represent vocabulary is a great prop and a great thing to use in the classroom when you're teaching with comprehensible input. And then you have sound effects. So if there's a vocabulary word that lends itself well to making a sound to show what it means, that's a great thing to do. You can have one student, you're our sound effects person, so anytime you hear this particular word, I want you to make this particular sound. Or you could have the whole class do it. So I just got an echo, sorry guys. So you can have the whole class do a sound effect. So you hear a certain word and the whole class breaks out into whatever that sound effect is that you have going along with it. So now that we know how to make comprehensible input, so what are some things that we can do in the classroom to use comprehensible input with our students? So one of the big things is personalized questions and answers, which often gets shortened to PQA. And in our Storyscape, we've got instances where you can engage your students in PQA. This is a great way to get them thinking about the vocabulary before they actually see it in context, to hear it lots of repetitions, and to think about the vocabulary in a personal way that pertains to them and makes it a lot more real for them. So like for this example right here, this was a discussion that was happening at the beginning of a unit, and I highlighted in green here some personalized questions that you can use to ask your students questions about themselves and relate to the content that they're going to be seeing in the story. So using those personalized questions and answers, get your students thinking about the vocab, using the vocab. It's a very low pressure situation because you're just having a conversation with your students and learning about them by using the target language. Another great thing that we have in our Storyscape that's a strategy for CI is picture talk. And picture talk is, pretty much what it sounds like. You take an interesting picture, something that is going to engage students, something that they can relate to, and you just talk about what you see. So for this example, I gave you a part of the picture. It was kind of a big screenshot to take here, but there's part of the picture. And then we give you a script of all of the questions that you can ask to get your students talking about that picture. This is a great way to take a look at the target culture. It's a great way to get them looking at vocabulary, giving opinions, and just, using that vocab over and over again to get lots of repetitions. Stories are another great CI strategy, and they're pretty much the backbone of comprehensible input, and especially in our Storyscape. So in our Storyscape, you have several stories, 5 stories that you work through, and these stories are the foundation of comprehensible input. So for this one, and Erin mentioned this already, you have the story itself, and you've got some audio that you can listen to the story as well. So these stories, they put the vocabulary that students need to acquire into context in a meaningful way and in an engaging way so that they read the story, they understand the language, and they acquire it without having to make a lot of conscious memorization effort. It just kind of comes in naturally. They acquire the language by reading the stories. And then we have Clip Chat. It used to be called Movie Talk, but they changed the name to Clip Chat. And this works really great with our authentic materials section. So in the authentic materials, we have some videos from the target cultures. And what you can do for a Clip Chat is you just play the video. Usually it doesn't have the volume on. Play the video, and then you stop it at particular places in the video. And then you just talk to your students about what's happening on the screen. So you can narrate it, and you can describe in English what's happening on the screen. You can even ask your students some questions about it. What do you see? What are they doing? What do you think they're saying? Things like that. Just keep going like that, talking about the entire video. So you stop it, you talk a little bit, watch a little bit more of the video. When you come to another scene that's really high interest, pause it, and then start talking again. What are you seeing on the screen now? What's different? What do you feel about this? What do you think? There's all kinds of things that you can ask as you're doing a Clip Chat. So those are, again, great with our authentic materials, the videos that we put in, a great way to provide CI to get your students using the target language and hearing it over and over again. So now that we know what comprehensible input is, let's look at some of the advantages that come with teaching with comprehensible input. So first of all, it helps you to build relationships with your students. You're using the language to interact with your students. Instead of just teaching them about it, you're teaching them about things, and you're getting to know your students through using the language. And that makes your relationships with your students so much stronger because they feel like they're integrated as a part of the class, and the class is all about them. It also helps you to teach culture in the target language. So you can use English to teach about what's happening in English-speaking countries because they have all of the vocabulary that they know. So it's not like a separate thing like it used to be where you teach about culture in their native language. You can actually teach about it in the target language. And another great advantage is active learning. Students are doing so much in a comprehensible input classroom. They're answering the PQA questions, the personalized questions and answers. They're acting out stories. They're using props. They're looking at illustrations. They're so much more active and taking a part in what's happening in the story that it really helps to keep them engaged and helps them to acquire the language so much quicker. So that's just about the end of my presentation. So just to kind of, sum up what we did, we looked at what comprehensible input is, which it basically is just using what students know plus a little bit more. We talked about comprehensible input versus traditional. So we know that it's different in vocabulary and that we have instead target structures. It's different in communication because we're focusing on just effective communication as opposed to perfect communication. And we pointed out that our Storyscape actually gives you both. You have the CI and you also have the traditional. We looked at ways to make comprehensible or to make your input comprehensible through things like translations, illustrations, acting, props, things like that. We talked about some CI strategies that you can use in the classroom that are built in to our Storyscape, such as the personalized questions and answers, or PQA, picture talks, stories, and the clip chat that you can use with the authentic resources. Then we looked at advantages of teaching with comprehensible input. Why would you even make this shift in your teaching? What's the benefit? And we talked about how it helps you to build better relationships with your students, that you can teach culture in a more effective way by using the target language, and that it makes your students more active learners. So that way they're actually going to learn more effectively because they're taking an active part in the learning process.